Then in the following centuries, as geography and cartography became much more precise, the use of the Zen map began to decline. And whereas up to the 18th century, the Zen map is clearly visible and recognizable, the pieces of the Zen map are recognizable in most charts and maps of the 16th, 17th, and even 18th century. Then the elements of the Zen map slowly begin to disappear as the contours of the world become more precise. Finally, in 1833, a Danish admiral by the name of Zartmann, Christian Zartmann, stuns the geographical community by giving a speech at the Royal Geographic Society, stating that the whole story of the Zen voyages and the map is just a tissue of fiction. It is a fable by an impostor and a forger, and nothing about it is true. And this is an extraordinary statement by a very respectable man. He was, Captain Zartmann was a great cartographer and hydrographer, and he was very, very respected in London at the time. So his statement created a huge impact in the community of geographers, and in particular at the Royal Geographic Society, which was the nub, the center of geographic activity. It was not until several years later that Richard Henry Major, one of the great British geographers of the Victorian age, looked into the story and prepared a paper for the Royal Geographic Society, stating that Zartmann was wrong and that the story was authentic, and indeed the international community owed a great deal to these two Venetians and their contribution to geography. At that point, however, the story of the Zen brothers had been tainted by the accusation of forgery. And despite Major's thorough and very documented rebuttal of the Danish admiral, the story of the Zen brothers really never recovered and gradually faded away from the history of geography, to the point that I myself, living in Venice at the time, had never heard of these two Venetians. And so I decided to look into the story myself and to make sense out of this very curious and puzzling story. How was I going to go about investigating this story? It seemed to me from the beginning that what I could contribute was to shed some light on the Venetian part of the story. In particular, it seemed to me that it was crucial to try to reconstruct as precisely as possible the lives of Niccolò and Antonio Zen, the two protagonists of this voyage, to see if indeed the story of their voyages in the North Atlantic fit with their biographies. And luckily the Venetian archives are still very rich in old documents, and it was possible indeed to reconstruct to a large degree certainly the life of Niccolò Zen and the life of his brother Antonio as well. As I suggested before, Niccolò and Antonio were both Venetian merchants, but they were very well known in Venice. They had participated in the war against the Genoese. Niccolò in particular had had a very important role. We know the history of his family, his wife, his children, where he lived, what he did, when and where, the ships and the galleys he captained in the Mediterranean. So that in effect we have a fairly precise idea of who Niccolò Zen was and why he would, even at this late stage in his life, decide that he should rig up a private ship and sail to the North Atlantic. It was an effort that was part of a broader strategic move by Venice, as I was suggesting before, to try to carve its niche in the Atlantic trade, and especially in the cod market, which was becoming so important in those days. The second element of my research really focused on the author of the book. In other words, the great-grandson of Antonio Zen, whose name, as I said, was also Niccolo Zen the Younger. Now, Niccolo the Younger is obviously much closer to us. He was born in 1515, so there's quite a deal of documentation in the Venetian archives about him. Niccolo the Younger is, of course, the main culprit. He is the forger. He is the man who put together this book with evil intents to show, possibly to show that the Venetians landed on the shores of America before Columbus and so on. And so it seemed to me fundamental to try to delineate the life of Niccolo Zen the Younger in a very precise way. And this is what I did, and this is what I was able to do in the Venetian archives, because, as I said, his life is very well documented. He was a very well-known Venetian statesman. He was a historian of great repute. He was not, however, a geographer. And although he decided to put together this book based on what he says, based on the materials that he had in the house, he also made a great deal of mistakes as he put this book together and as he drew the map that I showed you. The accusations against him, based on the errors and mistakes that are in the narrative and in the map, are not really convincing, and for a lot of people are, on the other hand, indices of the authenticity. In other words, the very mistakes in the narrative and in the map suggest authenticity rather than the opposite. Parallel to my researches about Niccolo Zen the Younger, I also looked in fairly closely to the life of the publisher of the book, because he was so closely associated with the project. His name was Francesco Marcolini, and he was a very famous publisher in the Renaissance in Venice, and the archives are also filled with material about his life. So it has been possible for me to reconstruct the relationship between these two men, which is crucial really to understanding the larger question of why the book was published and why it was put together. The third part of my research involved traveling to all the places where the story took place. I traveled to the Orkneys, I traveled to Shetland, I traveled to the Faroes, I traveled to Iceland, I traveled to Greenland and to the coast of North America to get a sense and to find traces of this story. I didn't travel with the intent of proving that the story was right, but I was interested in finding traces and elements of the story. I found, for example, that a lot of the descriptions in the narrative actually do correspond to places in the various locations where I was. For example, there is a very detailed description of a monastery and the life in the monastery, and the fact that the monks use sulfurous water to heat up the monastery, and it describes the way their building techniques